The city of Bozeman, Montana is going to outlaw urban camping, allow fines and jail time for offenders. Now, it's been a while since we spoke about housing here on Independent Thought, but as most of you know who have been following my channel for a while here, this is an incredibly important subject for me. So we had to bring it back to the forefront here, especially in my state of Montana. We're going to put this up on the screen now. This is from the Montana Free Press. This is our cover sheet here. It's again saying Bozeman to outlaw urban camping, allowed fines and jail time for offenders. The city's commission voted to criminalize camping on city streets beginning next year with stricter regulations in place until then. From the article itself, it says that the commission is expected to formally adopt Ordinance 2172, which sets an expiration date on urban camping in the city, and until then gives the city manager full authority to move campers to wherever he sees fit and creates a permit system that includes $25 a month per fees. Permits will be granted up to 30 days with renewals considered on a case-by-case basis. That seems incredibly sketchy. Okay. The ordinance criminalizes urban camping in Bozeman on November 1st, 2025. These new rules will be backed by misdemeanor criminal fines from $100 to $500 and up to 10 days in jail for those who fail to comply. Bozeman's previous urban camping ordinance imposed $25 civil fees for infractions similar to parking tickets and fewer pathways to criminal enforcement. Now, here to speak with me about all of this is the deputy mayor of Bozeman, Joey Morrison. Joey, thank you for coming back on the show. How are you doing today?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm doing all right. I'm hanging in there. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here though.
Hey, I appreciate you coming back on, and it's been a few times for you now. We always appreciate having you on here to talk about Bozeman and what's going on over there. First and foremost, before we kind of get into the details here, just really general question. Why is this happening right now? Like, what actually sparked this change in city policy?
Yeah, there's sort of the big why, what got us here, and then the littler why. And I'll try to be as quick and concise as possible. The big why is this is an issue that, homelessness, folks sleeping on the streets in the United States is one of the most stigmatized topics in any city in America. It's filled with misinformation, it's filled with myths, it's filled with conspiracy about how it works, of what's happening and who's benefiting from it. So that's one of the bigger whys is, when our communities are outraged about these things, it's really hard to actually penetrate into, hey, here's the reality, here's what works, here's what doesn't, here's what might just feel in your heart like cathartic to see, like you're angry with folks in the street, so we need to punish them into compliance. We know that those things don't work. So that's like the big why. The littler why is that the Supreme Court opened the floodgates for cities to pass laws like this to say, hey, if you don't like folks sleeping on the streets in your community, if you don't like homeless folks in your community, then great. We've taken away the Ninth District Court decision to say you can't do that. We've overturned it. We said, go for it. Do whatever you want to do. And so in some ways, it was a matter of time for cities like Bozeman, for cities like Missoula to start looking at, hey, how do we institute harsher penalties based on kind of an old vision of how to get folks off of the street and just punish people into compliance.
Yeah.
And moving forward with a law like that just felt like, eventually this was going to come in front of us.
Now, here's the thing that I always come to whenever, these conversations come up. It would seem from an outside perspective, from the perspective of the average every, day citizen here, is that the people in our government, they're trying to address our problems, right? And so the problem here in question is homelessness. Is the rise of people who are unhoused in the Bozeman area.
Yeah.
So just really directly here, is this actually going to help that problem? Are we going to see a reduction in homelessness because of this problem? Are the people who are unhoused actually going to benefit from this decision? Like, what do you say to that?
Yeah, that is the part that, and I think I should have explained in the previous part that I was one of the dissenting votes on this. It
Yeah.
passed through our commission 3-2. For that main reason was what I was most concerned about is that, so like one of the things that we heard from our city attorney and from one of our city attorneys and from our city manager was this idea of trying to put different buckets of folks on the street, that there are some who are taking advantage of this, who say rent is for suckers and I'd rather live on the street. And they're living in a luxurious, Winnebago or something like that instead of, trying to subsist and are in actual poverty. And then there are those that are in actual poverty, they're actually unhoused, they're involuntarily homeless, as a term that was nicely christened to the Supreme Court's opinion as well. So if that's the goal, right? If the expressed goal of this law is to penalize those folks who are making everybody look bad, who actually could get into housing, who don't need to be here, who are van life tourists, what have you.
Yeah.
Well, this law will actually punish those with the least likelihood of compliance the harshest. The folks who already can't afford an additional $25, who maybe have a substance abuse disorder or are using drugs or have a mental health issue that keeps them from being compliant with other parts of the law, not just paying the $25 fee, but their time, manner, and place requirements as well. Those are the folks that get this misdemeanor penalty most regularly. And so it's actually regressive. It targets the most vulnerable hardest instead of what these types of laws often try to do. And that's what happens when we try to do something that, the law is a blunt instrument. It can't be as surgical. And so that's one of the weaknesses of looking at laws like this anyway.
Yeah. So to that end, I want to go ahead and speak to you directly about something that I saw that your city manager had said. We're going to put this up on the screen now. This is also from that Montana Free Press article. So that interim city manager Chuck Wynn said that this current ordinance isn't working, but the new set of rules regulating exactly where and for how long people can camp in Bozeman will ultimately lead to fewer homeless people in the city. Quote, through this ordinance, we are going to see less campers on the streets. We know that for a fact, Wynn said. So you and your city managers, obviously something that you're going to be that you work with pretty consistently since you've taken this role as deputy mayor. Do you agree with his assessment, or do you feel differently about what he just said just there?
Yeah, I think we will, to my previous point, we will see fewer folks on the street, because there will just be some folks who get pushed out, who can't handle the cruelty, or they become even more fearful of the already abundant harassment that these folks experience, and now adding potential law enforcement intervention, potential code enforcement interactions as well. That yes, absolutely, some folks are going to say, holy cow, this community that's my home for many of them doesn't want me anymore. But the issue that I believe will stand is that we will concentrate the most vulnerable folks will get stuck here for longer. And that was a lot of what I spoke to during the meeting, is that these types of penalties prolong the journey for someone who is on the street. Every time they get, a misdemeanor penalty, you get, and this is something that the city manager pointed to as well, is it's up to $500 and up to 10 days in jail. Well, maybe the judge waives it the first time. Maybe they get a delayed sentence the first time, or maybe the second time. But if they get 3 or 4 or 5, they're probably going to end up in jail. They're probably going to see jail time. And so now we are actually compounding the barriers that we know keep folks from permanent and stable housing by our own policy, while we also spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in transitional housing and homelessness infrastructure. And that's one of the parts that I find really hard to be able to match up. Is on one hand, we say we want to invest in the solutions, but on the other, we make those solutions harder to achieve.
Right. And, seeing these policies creep up, we're seeing them in Bozeman, we're seeing them in Missoula. I know that Billings and Helena have also passed, recent ordinances as well. Why is there such a disconnect, do you think, between where these governments are at and then where these people are at? Because, just from the time that I've spent talking to people who are unhoused, usually it's either people who fell on really hard times, or people who are experiencing some kind of a health crisis, whether it's a physical health crisis, mental health crisis. Why is there such a disconnect between the city governments who seem to be treating these people like, oh, they just don't seem to really want to work, that's why they're on the streets, and the reality of the situation? Why do you think that is?
I mean, I'll give a few answers to that. One that's maybe a little bit more compassionate and gracious to folks who are passing these types of laws. Really the only, and this is something that I continue to tell folks as well, like, cities in Montana aren't the ones allowing homelessness to continue. The only governments that are allowing homelessness to continue are state and federal governments. Those are the only levels of government that sit on the resources and financing to be able to inject a significant amount of capital into communities to say, okay, solve this. Get your crisis stabilization centers, get your addiction centers, get your facilities and transitional housing infrastructure online in such a way that it can meet the needs of every single soul in the United States who's sleeping on the street. We have absolutely the money to be able to do that, but we don't get it, right? We're stuck with this unfunded mandate to try to solve this problem with limited tools and limited resources. So I think that seduction of, that comes out, I think, in the city manager's quote there, even is just, what if we can inconvenience these folks out of here, we'll all be better for it, including them. That's the story that gets told as well, is that
Right.
somehow this is better for the folks who are on the street. The more cynical answer is that it's an eyesore, that it hurts the business community, as they say. Tourism seems to be alive and well in both Bozeman and Missoula. They
Yeah.
still seem to be destination cities, despite there being folks who sleeping in campers and living in poverty. That hasn't seemed to stop fly fishing guides or billionaires and skiers from still coming to this community and spending their money. But that, I think, is one of the more cynical sides, is these are folks who are camping in front of undeveloped commercial lots and folks who would bid and potentially build multi-million-dollar projects that would generate tax revenue for the city. Those are an eyesore, and so we're missing out on every opportunity to generate tax revenue to provide more services for the constituents of the city of Bozeman. So that, therefore, we need to get these folks out of there. We need to move them somewhere that's not as costly.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard for me to, be a little, I'm trying to be objective here, but it's hard for me not to think that that cynical side might be playing a stronger role in all of this. But let's kind of break down one more part of this equation, which is the cost of it. This is something that I had a couple different people reach out to me from the city of Bozeman, followers who I have who live in that area. They wanted to talk about the actual cost of the community. So, and if any of this is incorrect, tell me if I'm wrong here. But the
Yeah.
process right now is you have to apply for a permit. You have to go and do an interview. If you're accepted, then you'll have to pay $25 a month. And then, if you don't, those penalties accrue, right? So the question to me, it seems like this is actually going to take more resources to put this into practice than you're actually going to ever generate, from these permit fees, right? I mean, you're in this scenario, you're going to have to
Mhm.
like staff people to actually to put out these permits, to receive these permits. You have to actually allocate more money to the police to enforce the ordinance to make sure that people are complying with all of this. And then on the back end, you have to pay prosecutors and other folks in the justice system in order to go after these people if they do violate these ordinances. It feels like to me that actually might end up costing the community, the taxpayers of Bozeman, more money than you would have ever generated from these $25 a month permits. Am I off base at all to feel that way?
No, not at all. So we knew that the $25 fee, and this was even expressed by the city manager, is not enough to recoup the operating costs.
Yeah.
How it was more just like, hey, this is something to demonstrate these folks have skin in the game, and so they're more likely to comply with the rest of it, or give them this opportunity to have to pay, show their interest with their dollars.
Yeah.
But absolutely, we know that punishing and enforcing criminalization laws around homelessness, around unhoused folks, is significantly more costly and more expensive to taxpayers, to communities, than just leaving them alone or helping to provide services and put them into housing. The department that'll be largely tasked with enforcing it, I wish I could have pulled up the exact budget number. I think it's probably about $800,000 a year. And a significant chunk of their responsibilities are working and enforcing these laws with folks on the street. And so, yeah, and that's not including all of the law enforcement time that's going in there. That's not including, um, you know, just the other nuts and bolts of how this process works. But I like that person was also getting at one of the questions that I posed, which was logistically, this is a really improbable system to work
Right.
effectively. I have conducted case review for several different agencies in our community, or conducted and participated in three different nonprofit agencies that work with, domestic violence survivors, folks who are unhoused. And the idea of conducting 100 renewals, effective case conferencings every month, is absolutely doomed to fail. That cannot be done in an ethical way where you're really able to interview or collaborate or look at all of the means and factors that contribute to that person's lived experience in that way. We would do it and it would take hours to go through 5 or 6 in a
Yeah.
week. And so this idea that somebody who also is not managed by a social worker, is not surrounded by other social workers, it doesn't really have a case conferencing potential, is really bizarre to me. That would be the type of way that we would set this up.
Okay. Kind of like getting towards the end here. I got a couple more questions for you. One of which is, for maybe people who aren't super familiar with all the different intricacies about like how our local governments work, how state governments work, how much money is actually available for all this. I'm looking at this from again from an outside perspective. I see my city, for instance, spending millions on just all kinds of programs related to addressing homelessness in some way, shape, or form, right?
Yeah.
Yet they are about to close one shelter that we have here in Missoula. Don't really know if there's a plan to open up another one. We have more people who are unhoused than we do have shelter space for them.
Yeah.
I feel like with the amount of money that goes towards some of these programs that's being paid to let's just call it what it is, consultants mostly. There could be money that goes towards permanent housing solutions, even if it was, buying some sheds from Home Depot
Mm-hmm.
or buying some or creating tiny homes for maybe a couple $1,000s. Probably could have had half, if not close to the full amount of unhoused people to be housed in some kind of structure somewhere in the city over the last, decade or so, given how much money is spent on all these programs. Is it wrong of me to assume that? Is there extra maybe nuance that I'm like missing here by thinking that?
There is some nuance to that, but absolutely, and to parts of it. It's actually funny that you mentioned that. Actually, some of the more conservative business owners in
Yeah.
Bozeman have said, if you find a place for them that's safer than being in the right of way, than being on the actual street where cars are driving by, I would cut a check. I would help to
Okay.
get these folks somewhere more appropriate than where they are. And this is from somebody who also doesn't really, frankly, care that much for the folks who are on the street, but still
Right.
recognizes the pragmatism of a dollar spent this way is more effective than a dollar spent this way. And so some of that is true, that there is a lot of I think if you were to look at the industry best practices, cities spending millions and millions of dollars to get shelters operating and not building alternative structures as well, but building these really, really fancy, really state of the art, homeless shelters is probably not the best impact, not dollar for dollar, as we could if we were looking at really decentralized, safe camping, safe parking areas that have some limited infrastructure to keep folks safe and warm. There's probably a lot of folks who would say, yeah, investing in some of these alternatives is going to be a better use of that money. But at the same time, we also don't. We're not all powerful, and nonprofits also have their goals, their ambitions, their programs that they have to manage, and sometimes we don't get to provide any direction or feedback. We just get to say, great, we're happy to be working with you on something. But yes, I mean, as cities are spending a significant amount of money, and this is where cities get doomed to fail as well, is that we're trying to solve what is like probably $250 million problem, $1 million at a time,
Yeah.
which means it will never get solved. It needs that rapid injection of serious capital to solve this problem, and it could be over. We could 10 years from now, the United States could never see homelessness in the fashion that we see it today if we were able to cut those checks. But we're just a country that's reluctant to do that.
All right, here, my final question for you. I know that you spent a lot of time working with the Bozeman Tenants United, the local tenants union there. I know that you were also getting involved with, social services programs, even before that as well. So being directly involved with folks is something that you're incredibly familiar with.
Mhm.
And I want to know, this is a two-pronged question here. You are now in a position of leadership, in the city government, deputy mayor. When it comes to the unhoused community in general, what is the idealistic way that you would like to solve this problem? And I think
Mm.
B, what is the realistic ways that you unfortunately have to go about doing it given the barriers that are presented to you?
Oh man. I mean, I think the big way is if kind of what I was even just getting at is just this being able to garner some mass injection of serious capital to, get a crisis stabilization center, get our addiction services, get wraparound case management for everybody who's on the streets in our community, and say, hey, this community cares for you and wants to take care of you and recognizes that where you're at is
Mhm.
not where you want to be either, and move towards, one of the things that we say in like unhoused services is like we want homelessness to be something that's rare and brief and one time. And
Yes.
those are the types of things that will get us closer to that. Where we are actually at is one where we get to incrementally try to carve out, tiny, tiny chunks of our budget to be able to try and experiment with different ideas. Things that I'm really excited about are upstream solutions. So when I'm looking at, hey, what's like the three-legged stool, which is something that I feel like I get analogies of constantly. What are the three legs of that stool to try to keep folks in housing, to keep folks more secure? One is to like keep folks in their homes as much as possible. And so that's tenant right to counsel programs. That's things that keep tenants in their homes, keep the most vulnerable in their homes. And then the other pieces are, of course, affordable housing infrastructure, transitional housing infrastructure, and preserving the naturally occurring affordable housing that we already have today. And so one of those chunks being this right to counsel. We know we've seen some communities where $1 they've spent on right to counsel, they've saved $12 on homelessness services. So we know that it can
Okay.
be a significantly more prudent financial investment.
Perfect. Joey Morrison, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We really do appreciate it. Deputy Mayor of Bozeman, where can people, I guess, be connected with what the city's doing online and kind of like stay up to date with what different ways you're trying to address these problems?
Yeah, if you want to find me as an individual, you can either find me on our city website or through social media. Still the Morrison for Bozeman Instagram, Facebook account. I still check regularly. For Bozeman folks, if you're looking at, hey, how do I stay plugged into what the city's doing? Our Engage Bozeman website has e-notifications and newsletters that you get a notification every time the city's doing anything. And that's where I've been really trying to send our constituents to get engaged.
All right, perfect. We'll have links for those in the episode description. For those who are interested, you can check in the description now and you will see those. Joey, thanks so much again for coming on the show. We hope to have you back on in the future. If you like this episode, please go ahead and share it online, and we will see you in the next one. Thank you for watching this video of Independent Thought. If you liked the conversation, please go ahead and give the video itself a like, and be sure to subscribe for future episodes on the channel.